At 11:23 on the morning of March 4, 1944, Colonel Don Blakesley glanced at his fuel gauge and looked down through the canopy of his P-51B Mustang at a sight no American fighter pilot had ever viewed from that height. Berlin, the German capital, spread out beneath him, gray and industrial, stretching to the horizon under a thin veil of haze. Blakesley had been fighting this war for 3 years. He had flown Spitfires with the Royal Air Force Eagle squadrons when the United States was still neutral. He had watched friends die over the English Channel, over France, over the Low Countries. And now he was here, 600 miles from his base in England, escorting American heavy bombers to the very heart of the Third Reich. His guns had jammed somewhere over Hanover. It did not matter. He remained with the formation anyway, because that was the kind of leader he was. His pilots needed to see his aircraft out in front. They needed to know that if they could make it to Berlin, so could he. What Blakesley did not know, what none of the American pilots knew, was that somewhere below them, German commanders were watching, and the sight of those long-nosed American fighters circling almost casually over the capital city told them something that intelligence reports and production statistics had failed to communicate. The war was lost. Hermann Göring, Reichsmarshal of the German Luftwaffe, would later tell his interrogators that when fighters appeared over Berlin, he understood the eventual outcome would be catastrophic. Different sources recorded his reflections in slightly different words over the years. Some quoted him as saying he knew the jig was up. Others recalled him stating plainly that the war was lost. The precise wording varied, but the meaning never did. The most powerful Air Force commander in Nazi Germany had seen American fighters over his capital and grasped what was coming. This is the story of how a single aircraft, born from British desperation and refined by American engineering, evolved from a disappointing performer into the weapon that broke the Luftwaffe. It is the story of the men who flew it, the men who built it, and the men who died because it arrived too late to save them. It is the story of how one airplane altered the course of history. To understand why Mustangs over Berlin mattered, you have to understand what came before. You have to understand Black Thursday. October 14, 1943. 291 Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses lifted off from bases across eastern England and turned toward Germany. Their target was Schweinfurt, a small Bavarian city that produced nearly half of all the ball bearings used by German industry. Ball bearings were everywhere, in tank turrets, aircraft engines, submarine propellers. Destroy the ball bearing factories, American planners believed, and you would cripple the German war machine. The bombers flew in tight formations, their gunners manning .50 caliber machine guns in every direction. Doctrine said they could defend themselves. Doctrine said mass defensive firepower would drive off any attacker. That doctrine was about to be proven catastrophically wrong. The problem was range. American fighter escorts, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolts, could only fly so far before their fuel ran low. They could accompany the bombers partway into Germany, but then they had to turn back. The bombers pressed on alone. The Luftwaffe knew this. They had learned exactly how far the American fighters could reach. They positioned their interceptors just beyond that limit and waited. When the Thunderbolts turned for home somewhere over the German border, the slaughter began. German fighters attacked the bomber formations in waves. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s came in from every direction. Some attacked head-on, their cannon shells smashing through cockpit glass and killing pilots in their seats. Others maneuvered off to the side and fired rockets into the tightly packed formations. The explosions sent bombers tumbling out of control, trailing fire and smoke, their crews bailing out into the frozen air or dying where they sat. The bomber crews fought back with everything they had. Their gunners claimed 186 German fighters destroyed that day, a figure wildly exaggerated. Actual German losses were between 35 and 38 aircraft. In return, the Luftwaffe shot down 60 American bombers. Another 17 were so badly damaged they had to be scrapped. 121 more returned with battle damage. 600 American airmen were killed, wounded, or captured in a single afternoon. The loss rate exceeded 20%. At that level, no bomber crew could expect to survive its required 25-mission tour. The arithmetic of attrition was merciless. Send a man up 25 times with a 20% loss rate per mission, and his chances of coming home were essentially zero. The human cost extended far beyond the men who died. Every bomber that went down carried 10 crewmen. Each had families waiting at home, parents, wives, sweethearts, who would receive telegrams beginning with the words, "The Secretary of War desires to express his deepest regret." Some families would learn months later that their sons or husbands had survived as prisoners of war. Many would never know exactly what happened to their loved ones. For the crews who survived and returned to their bases in England, the psychological toll was crushing. They had watched friends die in burning aircraft. They had seen parachutes that never opened, men falling through 30,000 feet of empty sky. They had felt their own airplane shudder under cannon fire, smelled burning hydraulic fluid, and felt icy wind blasting through holes torn in the fuselage. And they knew that tomorrow, or the day after, they would have to do it all again. The 8th Air Force had been shattered. Deep penetration raids into Germany without fighter escort were immediately suspended. The bombers would not return to Schweinfurt for 4 months. The pause was not an official admission of defeat, but it amounted to the same thing. American strategic doctrine had called for daylight precision bombing of key industrial targets. That doctrine required flying deep into enemy territory without fighter escort. Such missions were suicidal. The British had confronted the same problem earlier in the war and reached a different conclusion. After suffering devastating losses in daylight raids in 1939 and 1940, RAF Bomber Command shifted to night operations. Under cover of darkness, British bombers could reach German cities without facing Luftwaffe fighters. The cost of night bombing was accuracy. Unable to see their targets clearly, British crews attacked area targets, entire cities rather than individual factories. This approach was morally controversial and strategically uncertain, but it was survivable. RAF crews had a reasonable chance of completing their tours. The Americans rejected this approach. They believed their heavy bombers, with sophisticated Norden bomb sights and concentrated defensive firepower, could operate effectively in daylight. They believed precision attacks on specific targets would be more effective than area bombing. They believed, in short, that they could succeed where the British had failed. Black Thursday destroyed those beliefs. The Norden bomb sight was indeed accurate, but accuracy meant nothing if the bombers were destroyed before reaching their targets. Massed defensive firepower was formidable, but not formidable enough to stop determined German interceptors. Everything the Americans believed about operating without fighter escort was wrong. General Henry Arnold, commander of the Army Air Forces, publicly described the loss of 60 bombers as incidental. Reality told a different story. Unescorted daylight bombing deep into Germany was suspended indefinitely. The entire strategic bombing campaign, the cornerstone of Allied strategy to defeat Nazi Germany, was on the verge of collapse. The bomber generals had promised that daylight precision bombing could win the war. Now those promises looked like fantasies. Without long-range fighter escort, the bombers could not survive. And no long-range fighter existed, or so everyone believed. The cost of those beliefs could be measured in empty bunks and unfinished letters home. In every bomber group across England, the mathematics of survival became a constant, unspoken presence. A man might lie awake at night and count the faces around him, knowing how many were unlikely to be there by Christmas. The odds were that stark, that unavoidable. The problem was not courage. American bomber crews possessed courage in abundance. They climbed into their aircraft day after day knowing the odds were against them. Knowing that statistical analysis gave them no realistic chance of finishing their tours, they flew anyway. The problem lay in the fundamental limitations of the aircraft they flew and the doctrine that governed their use. The B-17 Flying Fortress was a remarkable machine. It could fly higher than most contemporary fighters, carry thousands of pounds of bombs hundreds of miles, absorb enormous damage, and still bring its crew home. Its .50 caliber machine guns covered nearly every angle of approach. A properly flown formation of B-17s was indeed a formidable defensive system, but not formidable enough. German pilots developed tactics specifically designed to defeat bomber formations. They attacked from the front, where defensive fire was weakest and where a single hit to the cockpit could kill the pilots instantly. They fired rockets from beyond machine gun range to break up formations, then hunted down stragglers one by one, concentrating on wounded bombers that had fallen out of position, knowing isolated aircraft were easy prey. Against these tactics, bomber doctrine had no answer. The only real solution was to have friendly fighters present to drive off the attackers. But the fighters could not be present because no fighter had the range. It was a problem that seemed to have no solution. The airplane that would change everything had been sitting in hangars across England for 2 years. Dismissed as a disappointment. The North American P-51 Mustang was born in 1940. Designed and built in just 102 days to meet a British purchasing request. The British needed fighters desperately, and the American Curtiss P-40 production lines were running at capacity. North American Aviation offered to design something better, faster. The original Mustang was a beautiful aircraft, sleek and fast, with an innovative laminar flow wing that reduced drag. But it had one critical flaw. Its Allison V1710 engine performed well at low altitude, but lost power above 15,000 feet at the heights where the bombers flew and where combat against the Luftwaffe took place. The Mustang was simply too slow. The problem was the supercharger, the Allison engine. Used a single-stage supercharger with a critical altitude of only 11,800 feet. Above that height, the engine simply could not compress enough thin air to maintain power. The Mustang would start strong in a climb, then gradually fall behind as the altitude increased. By the time it reached 20,000 feet, where the bombers cruised and where German interceptors lurked, the Mustang was gasping for breath. The Royal Air Force used its Mustangs for ground attack and tactical reconnaissance roles where high-altitude performance did not matter. The aircraft was considered a nice design with a disappointing engine. It seemed destined to remain a footnote in aviation history. Then on April 30, 1942, a Rolls-Royce test pilot named Ronald Harker visited the Air Fighting Development Unit at RAF Duxford and asked to fly one of the American fighters. He took the Mustang up for 30 minutes, ringing it through its paces, and came down with an idea that would transform the war. The airplane, Harker reported, was magnificent below 15,000 foot fast, maneuverable, with excellent range. Its only weakness was altitude performance. And that weakness came from the engine. The Allison simply could not deliver power in thin air. But Rolls-Royce had an engine that could. The Merlin 60 series with its two-stage two-speed supercharger was the power plant that made the Spitfire competitive at any altitude. What if you took the Mustang airframe and replaced its Allison engine with a Merlin? Harker immediately phoned Ray Dorey, head of Rolls-Royce's experimental division, to advocate for the conversion. His superiors were intrigued. By June 1942, Rolls-Royce had begun converting Mustang airframes to Merlin power at their facility in Hucknall. The first converted aircraft, designated the Mustang X, flew on October 13, 1942. The results were nothing short of spectacular. The Merlin-powered Mustang reached 433 miles per hour at 22,000 feet. That was more than 100 miles per hour faster than the Allison version at the same altitude. The aircraft could climb almost twice as fast, and crucially, it retained the original Mustang's exceptional range, a quality that came from its efficient aerodynamic design and large internal fuel tanks. The engineering explanation was straightforward. The Merlin 60 series engine had a two-stage supercharger with an intercooler that maintained power at high altitude where the air was thin. The Allison had only a single-stage supercharger optimized for lower altitudes. At 15,000 feet, both engines produced similar power. At 25,000 feet, the Merlin was producing full-rated horsepower while the Allison was gasping, but the transformation involved more than just swapping engines. The Merlin was heavier than the Allison and required different cowling to accommodate its larger supercharger. The aircraft's center of gravity had to be adjusted by moving the wings slightly forward. New intake designs were needed for the intercooler. The propeller was changed from 3 blades to 4 to absorb the additional power. North American Aviation's engineers worked through these problems with remarkable speed. The company that had designed the original Mustang in 102 days proved equally capable of redesigning it in months rather than years. The key was collaboration. British and American engineers shared information freely, with Rolls-Royce providing detailed specifications for the Merlin in North American adapting their airframe to accommodate it. Major Thomas Hitchcock, the American assistant Irachas in London, served as a crucial liaison, ensuring that promising technical developments were communicated to the right people on both sides of the Atlantic. Hitchcock was an unusual figure for a wartime diplomatic post. A wealthy polo player and investment banker before the war, he had flown combat missions in the First World War. As a teenager, escaped from a German prisoner of war camp, and walked 100 miles to Switzerland. He understood both aviation technology and combat requirements, and he championed the Merlin Mustang project with bureaucratic skill. He predicted the Merlin Mustang would be the best fighter of 1943. Tragically, Hitchcock was killed in a flying accident in April 1944, just weeks after the first Mustangs reached Berlin. He died testing P-51 dive characteristics near Salisbury, England. Unable to pull out of a high-speed dive while investigating the same instability problems that had killed other pilots, he never saw the full impact of the aircraft he had done so much to promote. For the first time, the Allies had a fighter that could fly all the way to Berlin, fight the Luftwaffe on equal terms, and fly all the way home. North American Aviation in California had been thinking along similar lines. Working with Packard, which was licensed building Merlin engines in Detroit, they developed their own conversion. The first American Merlin Mustang, designated the XP-51B, flew on November 30, 1942. The U.S. Army Air Forces were so impressed that they ordered 400 P-51Bs in August 1942 before a single Merlin Mustang had even flown. It was a gamble, but the need was desperate, and the preliminary calculations were promising. Production began in earnest in 1943. The first P-51Bs arrived in England with the 354th Fighter Group in November. These aircraft, originally assigned to the 9th Air Force for tactical operations, were immediately pressed into service as bomber escorts by the 8th Air Force. The transformation of the American fighter force happened with remarkable speed. In December 1943, the 8th Air Force had only a handful of Mustangs. By March 1944, entire fighter groups were converting. By June, the P-51 equipped the majority of American escort squadrons in England. The logistics were staggering. Each Mustang needed spare parts, ammunition, fuel, and trained ground crews. Pilots had to be converted from whatever they had been flying before, learning the quirks of the new aircraft, its capabilities and limitations, its tricks for survival. Some pilots adapted faster than others. Don Blakesley's 4th Fighter Group received their P-51Bs on February 25, 1944. When higher command expressed concern that the group was not ready, Blakesley insisted his pilots would learn to fly the Mustang on the way to the target. 3 days later, on February 28, the group flew its first Mustang combat mission. The change in tactics came from the top. In January 1944, General Jimmy Doolittle took command of the 8th Air Force. Doolittle was famous for leading the first American bombing raid on Tokyo in 1942. But his most important contribution to the air war would be a simple change in fighter doctrine. The fighters will no longer be tied to the bombers. Diddle announced their job was not merely to protect the formations. Their job was to destroy the Luftwaffe. It was a fundamental change in doctrine. Under the old rules, escort fighters stayed close to the bombers, weaving above them in protective patterns. They engaged German interceptors only when those interceptors threatened the bombers directly. This defensive posture surrendered the initiative to the Luftwaffe. German pilots could choose when and where to attack, could set up their assault runs unmolested, could concentrate on the bombers while ignoring the escorts. Doolittle's new doctrine reversed everything. American fighters would now fly ahead of the bomber formations, seeking out German interceptors and attacking them before they could reach the bombers. They would strafe German airfields. They would hunt the Luftwaffe wherever it could be found. The bomber crews were horrified. They saw their protective umbrella being stripped away, their little friends, abandoning them to chase glory in individual dogfights. But Diddle understood something the bomber crews could not see from their gun positions. The only way to protect the bombers in the long term was to destroy the German fighter force. Not just the airplanes, but the pilots. Germany could build new fighters, replacing experienced pilots. Took years. The stage was set for the decisive air battle of the European War. The offensive began on February 20, 1944, Operation Argument. It was called officially. History would remember it as Big Week. For 6 days, the 8th Air Force and the 15th Air Force, flying from bases in Italy, threw everything they had at German aircraft factories. The targets were carefully chosen. Messrs. Schmidt plants at Regensburg and Augsburg, Falk-Wolf facilities at Aschersleben and Tuttow, Junkers factories at Bernburg, ball bearing plants that had been left alone since Black Thursday. The scale of operations was unprecedented. On February 20 alone, more than 1,000 bombers took off from English and Italian bases. Fighter escorts numbered in the hundreds. The Luftwaffe had never faced anything like it. General Frederick Anderson, who planned the offensive, explained the strategy. The goal was to force the Germans to fight, to make them put every airplane they had into the air to defend those factories. Because once they were in the air, American fighters could get at them. It was a brutal calculation. The bombers were bait, flying deep into Germany to draw out the defenders. The fighters were the real weapon, tasked with destroying the German interceptors, who rose to attack the bombers. Every bomber lost was a tragedy for its crew. But if the fighters killed enough German pilots in exchange, the strategy would succeed. The weather during Big Week was terrible with low clouds and icing, conditions that forced many bombers to abort their missions or attack secondary targets. Navigation errors led to tragic mistakes, including the accidental bombing of Dutch cities that killed hundreds of civilians. War is never clean, and the combined bomber offensive was grimly costly for everyone involved. More than 3,000 bomber sorties were flown during the 6 days of Big Week. The 8th Air Force alone lost 137 heavy bombers with another 20 scrapped due to damage. The 15th lost 90. RAPH Bomber Command attacking the same targets at night lost between 131 and 157 aircraft depending on how the losses were counted. The losses were heavy in absolute terms, but they represented a much smaller percentage of the attacking force than Black Thursday. The American bomber force was growing faster than the Germans could shoot it down, and fighters were doing their work. The Luftwaffe threw everything into the defense. Twin-engine Messrs Bf-110s and Me-410s, heavily armed but slow, tried to break up the bomber formations with rockets and heavy cannon. Single-engine Bf-109s and W-190s provided escort for the heavy fighters and attacked any bombers that strayed from the formation. But now they faced the Mustangs. The Germans had no answer for the American tactics. Their heavy fighters loaded with rockets and cannon could not maneuver against the nimble Mustangs. Their single-engine fighters designed for short-range interception found themselves outranged and outnumbered. For every American fighter the Luftwaffe shot down, it lost 3 or 4 of its own. The Merlin Mustang's performance advantages were overwhelming at the altitudes where combat took place. At 25,000 feet, the P-51B could reach 441 mph. While the Bf-109 struggled to match 390, the Mustang could dive faster, climb faster, and turn tighter than anything the Germans put against it. And unlike the German fighters, which had to land and refuel after 45 minutes of combat, the Mustang could fight for hours and still have fuel to spare. American pilots quickly learned to exploit these advantages. They developed tactics that maximized the Mustang's strengths while minimizing exposure to the German fighter remaining advantages. High-speed slashing attacks from above became the standard approach. Dive on the enemy, fire a quick burst, and zoom back up to altitude before they could respond. The Germans called it boom and zoom. Whatever they called it, it was killing them. Worse, the Luftwaffe was losing pilots it could not replace. During Big Week, more than 100 experienced German fighter pilots were killed or captured. These were not fresh trainees, but veterans with dozens of missions. Men who had been fighting since the Battle of Britain or the invasion of Russia. Their skills had been honed over years of combat. Now they were gone, and the pilots who replaced them had a fraction of their experience. The German training pipeline was already struggling. Fuel shortages had cut training hours drastically. New pilots were arriving at frontline units with barely 160 hours of flight time, less than half of what their American counterparts received. These inexperienced pilots were fed into the meat grinder of the air war, and most did not survive their first few missions. By the end of February, the Luftwaffe had lost more than 30% of its fighter aircraft in Western Europe. The losses in March would be even worse. March 4, 1944, the first American escort mission to Berlin. Colonel Don Blakesley led his 4th Fighter Group from their base at Debden, 40 miles north of London. The pilots had been flying their P-51Bs for just a week. Some had only a few hours in the new aircraft. When higher command expressed concern that the group was not ready, Blakesley's response was characteristic. His pilots would learn to fly the Mustang on the way to the target. Approximately 30 bombers of the 13th Combat Bomb Wing set out that morning, escorted by 28 Mustangs. The target was the German capital itself, the symbolic heart of the Nazi regime. Every German fighter within range would rise to defend it. The Americans were counting on that. The weather turned bad over Germany, limiting the effectiveness of the bombing, but the fighters pressed on, and for the first time, American single-engine fighters flew over the city that had been untouchable for so long. The German defenders were shocked. Ground controllers tracking the American formation kept reporting their position, expecting them to turn back at any moment. When the fighters kept coming, pushing deeper and deeper into Germany, the controllers refused to believe their own radar. American single-engine fighters could not reach Berlin. Everyone knew that 2 days later, on March 6, the full attack came. 800 bombers, escorted by more than 900 fighters, struck Berlin in the largest daylight raid of the war to that point. The Luftwaffe responded with everything it had. The fighting was savage. 69 American bombers were shot down, the highest single-day loss since Black Thursday. But this time there was a difference. The escorts were there all the way to the target and all the way back, and the Luftwaffe paid for every bomber it destroyed. 160 German fighters were shot down on March 6 alone. The exchange rate was roughly 2-to-1 in favor of the Americans. Dramatic reversal. From the dark days of October, Captain Don Gentile of the 4th Fighter Group shot down 3 German fighters over Berlin that day, bringing his total to 18 victories. His wingman, Lieutenant John Godfrey, got 2 more. The two of them had become the most feared team in the 8th Air Force, flying together, protecting each other's blind spots. They had developed an almost telepathic coordination that made them deadly. They were just getting started. Back at Debden after the mission, a reporter from the New York Times caught Captain Pierce McKinnon outside the 335th Squadron dispersal and asked if they had met up with any German fighters. McKinnon's reply became legendary. Millions, boy. Millions. But the real significance of the Berlin raids was not the bombers that got through or the fighters that were shot down. It was simpler than that. American fighters were over Berlin. For 3 years, Hermann Göring had promised the German people that no enemy bomb would ever fall on the capital when British bombers proved him wrong in 1940. He had said no enemy would fly over Berlin by day. Now, American fighters circled freely over the city, their propellers glinting in the spring sunlight, visible proof that the Luftwaffe could no longer defend German airspace. The psychological impact was devastating. German civilians who had believed in the invincibility of their air force now watched American aircraft overhead with impunity. German pilots who had once been hunters now found themselves hunted. The Luftwaffe's commander had been a fighter ace himself. In the First World War, one of the best Germany produced. He had led the legendary Richthofen circus after the Red Baron's death. He understood air combat at a fundamental level. He also understood logistics. A fighter over Berlin meant a fighter that had taken off in England, flown 600 m across occupied Europe, fought its way through German defenses, and still had enough fuel to fly 600 m home. The only way to do that was with an aircraft that had extraordinary range. The Germans had nothing comparable. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 was an excellent fighter, but it was designed for short-range operations. Even with drop tanks, it could not match the Mustang's reach. The Focke-Wulf F-190 had similar limitations. German pilots were fighting over their own territory within sight of their own airfields, and they were still being outranged by American escorts. General Adolf Galland, the Luftwaffe's general of the fighter arm, later described the moment when he personally confirmed what Göring feared. When reports came in that American single-engine fighters were over Berlin, the official position was that it was impossible. There were no long-range escort fighters. Some staff officers suggested the American pilots must have gotten lost. Or perhaps they were planning to crash land in Sweden. Galland decided to see for himself. He took off in his Focke-Wulf with another general and they flew toward where the Americans were reported. They found them over Germany, exactly where they were not.
supposed to be. The Americans found them, too.
According to Gallen's own memoir, he escaped by firing his guns and using the smoke and shell casings to convince the pursuing Mustangs that someone was shooting at them from behind. The other general was shot down. There were no more arguments about whether American fighters could reach Berlin.
The killing continued through the spring of 1944.
April 8 was one of
the bloodiest days for the Luftwaffe. The 4th Fighter Group alone claimed 33 German aircraft destroyed, the highest single mission total for any American unit in the war. The Luftwaffe lost nearly 200 fighters that day. The Germans tried to adapt. They developed new tactics, new formations, new ways of attacking the bomber streams.
They rushed improved aircraft into service, including the revolutionary Me-262 jet fighter.
None of it mattered. The fundamental problem was attrition.
Every day, the Luftwaffe lost pilots.
Every day, their replacements were less experienced.
Every day, the Americans grew stronger as new groups arrived from
the training pipeline.
By May 1944, German fighter pilot training had been cut to just 112 hours, barely enough to
learn basic flying skills. American pilots arrived at their units with 450 hours or more. In combat, experience was survival.
The green German pilots died in droves.
The numbers told the story. In January 1944, the Luftwaffe lost nearly 17% of its fighter pilots.
In February, another 18%.
In March, approximately 22%. In April, similar losses continued.
In May, 25%.
An air force cannot sustain such monthly casualties and remain effective. The Luftwaffe's fighter arm was bleeding to death.
The Germans tried everything to slow the bleeding. They rushed new aircraft designs into production.
They reorganized their fighter units to concentrate strength at critical points.
They developed heavy fighter formations, specifically designed to break through the escort screen and reach the bombers.
None of it worked. The STM-Gruppen were the most dramatic response. These were units equipped with heavily armored Focke-Wulf 190s. Their pilots sworn to close to point-blank range and destroy bombers or die trying. The armor added weight and reduced performance, making these aircraft easy prey for Mustangs, but the Sturmgruppen pilots pressed home their attacks with fanatic determination. Some succeeded.
Individual bomber groups suffered terribly when Sturmgruppen broke through their escort.
But for every bomber destroyed, multiple German fighters were lost. The exchange rate was never in Germany's favor. Problem was not tactics or equipment or even courage. The problem was numbers.
America was producing pilots faster than Germany could kill them.
Germany was losing pilots faster than it could replace them.
Every week the disparity grew wider.
Every week the Luftwaffe grew weaker. And June was coming. June 6, 1944. D-Day, the largest amphibious invasion in history. 156,000 Allied soldiers crossed the English Channel and stormed the beaches of Normandy. They were supported by nearly 12,000 aircraft, the greatest concentration of air power ever assembled. Fighters flew continuous patrols over the beaches. Bombers struck German positions inland. Transport aircraft dropped paratroopers behind enemy lines. The Luftwaffe's response was tragically inadequate.
The most famous German attack of the day came from Oberleutnant Isef Priller,
commander of Jag-Wad 26. He and his wingman Unteroffizier Heinzwood Arkic
took off from their base near Lille and flew west toward the beaches. They dodged Allied formations, found the invasion fleet spread across the horizon, and made a single strafing pass over what the British called Sword Beach. Priller's attack became legendary, later immortalized in film. But while it was the most dramatic Luftwaffe response of the morning, it was not the only one. Other German aircraft flew sorties throughout the day, including attacks by Kampfgeschwader 54 on British positions. Yet the total German effort remained pitiful compared to the Allied Armada overhead. For the entire day, the Luftwaffe managed only 319 sorties over Normandy. The Allies flew 14,674. The ratio was approximately 46 to 1. General Eisenhower had promised his troops before the invasion, "If you see fighting aircraft over you, they will be ours.
It was not bravado, it was simple fact. The air superiority that made
D-Day possible had been won in the spring of 1944, won by Mustang pilots over Berlin and Leipzig and Brunswick.
And Frankfurt, won by bomber crews who served as bait to draw the Luftwaffe into battle, won by mechanics and
armorers who kept the planes flying and the guns firing.
The price had been high. Thousands of American airmen died in the skies over Germany.
But they had accomplished something no Air Force had ever done. They had destroyed the
enemy's ability to contest the sky.
In the weeks following D-Day, the consequences of Luftwaffe weakness became
brutally apparent.
German armored divisions trying to reach the front were pounded from the air.
Tank columns that moved by day were attacked by swarms of Allied fighter bombers. Artillery positions that revealed themselves were immediately targeted.
Supply convoys were shot to pieces. Field Marshal Owen Rommel, commanding Army Group B in Normandy,
wrote despairingly to his wife, "The enemy has complete control of the air over the battle area and up to about 100 km behind the front. Every movement of any significance during the day draws bombing and strafing." German generals tried to adapt by moving only at night, but this slowed their operations catastrophically. Reinforcements that
should have reached the front in hours took days instead.
Counterattacks that required precise timing became impossible to coordinate. The breakthrough at St. Lo in late July shattered the German defensive line in Normandy.
Allied armored columns poured through the gap, racing across France at speeds that German intelligence could
not track.
Paris was liberated in August. By September, Allied forces were
approaching the German border.
All of this was possible because the Luftwaffe could not intervene.
German fighters that rose to contest the Allied advance were shot down by the ever-present Mustangs. German ground attack aircraft
were hunted before they could reach their targets.
German reconnaissance planes were destroyed before they could report Allied movements. The war continued for 11 more months after D-Day. The Luftwaffe never recovered. German aircraft production actually peaked in September 1944, turning out nearly 4,000 fighters in a single month.
But there were not enough pilots to fly them, not enough fuel to train new pilots, not enough experienced leaders
to teach them how to survive. The jets arrived too late and in too few numbers to matter. The Me-262 was faster than any
Allied fighter, but it was complex and unreliable, and its pilots were often inexperienced men who had no business flying the most advanced aircraft in the world.
By January 1945, new German
fighter pilots were arriving at their units with as little as 50 hours of total flight time.
Many crashed on their first operational flights before they ever saw an enemy aircraft.
The Mustang squadrons, meanwhile, ranged freely over
Germany.
They shot down German fighters wherever they found them. They strafed airfields, destroying aircraft on the
ground.
They attacked trains and trucks and anything else that moved. The strategic bombing campaign, so close to
failure in October 1943, achieved its objectives. German oil production collapsed under the weight of sustained attacks. German industry, dispersed and hidden,
though it was, could not keep pace with the destruction.
German cities burned. When the war ended in May 1945, American
pilots in Europe had claimed nearly 5,000 German aircraft destroyed in air combat.
The Mustang accounted for the majority of those victories. Hermann Göring survived the war. He surrendered to American forces in May 1945 and was tried at Nuremberg for crimes against humanity. During his captivity, he was interviewed extensively about the air war. In those interrogations recorded in the USFE Air Intelligence Summary of June 1945,
Göring stated that when long-range fighters appeared over Berlin, he knew the eventual results would be tragic.
He credited long-range fighters with delivering a major strategic blow to German planning and considered them
collectively as one of the most decisive factors in the ultimate outcome of the war.
The Reichsmarschall, the second
most powerful man in Nazi Germany, had watched American fighters over his capital city and understood that the war
was unwinnable.
All the promises of Nazi propaganda, all the boasts of German technological superiority, all the claims of inevitable victory collapsed in that moment.
The Allies could reach anywhere. The Luftwaffe could stop nothing. Göring was convicted of war crimes and sentenced to death. He cheated the hangman by taking cyanide.
The night before his execution, Adolf Galland, the general of the fighter arm, survived the war as well.
He had been
relieved of his command in January 1945 after repeated conflicts with Göring over the conduct of the air war.
Given
permission to return to combat flying, he formed a special unit of jet pilots that flew M262s in the final weeks of
the war.
After the war, Galland worked as a consultant to the Argentine Air Force and later ran his own business in
Germany.
He became friends with many of his former enemies, including British ace Douglas Bader and American ace
Robert Johnson. He died in 1996 at the age of 83. He never forgot the day he
flew up to see the American fighters for himself and barely escaped with his life.
Don Blakesley, the colonel who led the first Mustangs over Berlin, flew more than 500 combat missions in the war.
He accumulated over 1,000 hours of combat flying time, more than any other American fighter pilot. He was grounded on October 30, 1944 against his will. General William Keeptainer, his superior, had lost too many experienced leaders and could not afford to lose
another.
That same day, Colonel Hubert Ski, commander of the legendary 56th Fighter Group, had gone down when his P-51's wing failed in a violent storm over Germany.
Ski survived and was
captured by the Germans, but his loss was a shock to the entire fighter command.
When Blakesley landed from what
turned out to be his last mission, Kempner was waiting on the flight line.
"You are grounded," the general told him. "I cannot afford to lose both of you."
Blakesley stayed in the Air Force after the war, serving in Korea and
eventually retiring as a colonel. He died in 2008 at the age of 90. One of the last surviving leaders of the air war over Germany.
His pilots, the men of the 4th Fighter Group, finished the war as one of the highest scoring
American units in any theater.
They claimed 583 enemy aircraft shot down in air combat with a victory-to-loss ratio of more than 2-1.
The group had come a long way from the Eagle Squadron,
volunteers who flew Spitfires when America was still at peace. The 4th was not the only group that distinguished itself.
The 56th Fighter
Group, flying P-47s for most of the war, destroyed more German aircraft in air
combat than any other 8th Air Force Fighter Group.
The 354th Fighter Group, the first to receive Mustangs in England, pioneered many of the escort tactics that other groups adopted. The 357th, the 359th, the 339th, each had
their own aces, their own traditions, their own battles won and lost.
Behind the kills and mission counts were thousands of individual stories. Young men from every state in America, most of them barely out of their teens, learned to fly high-performance aircraft and went to war against the most experienced fighter force in the world.
Some became famous. Captain Clarence Anderson of the 357th Fighter Group shot down 16 NA-quarter German aircraft and survived 2 complete combat tours without ever being hit. Major George Prey of the 352nd
Fighter Group became one of the highest-scoring Mustang aces before being killed by friendly fire on Christmas Day 1944. Captain John Godfrey, Don Gentile's wingman, compiled 18 victories before being shot down and captured in August 1944. Most were not famous. They did their jobs, flew their missions, and if they were lucky, went home when their tours were complete. The ones who died were mourned by their squadron mates and then replaced by fresh faces from the training pipeline. War does not wait for grief.
The ground crews deserved as much credit as the pilots.
These men worked in all weather, often through the night, to keep the fighters flying. They patched bullet holes, replaced worn parts, loaded ammunition, and refueled aircraft in conditions that ranged from
freezing mud to summer heat.
A Mustang without a ground crew was useless. The pilots knew this and were grateful for it. The relationship between a pilot and his crew chief was often the closest bond on the base. The crew chief lived with that airplane, knew every quirk and rattle, could diagnose problems by the sound of the engine.
When a pilot failed to return, the crew chief felt the loss as personally as any squadron mate.
And when a pilot came back with his aircraft shot full of holes, The crew chief would work through the night to have it ready for the next mission.
The early P-51Bs had their share of mechanical problems.
The guns, mounted at an angle to fit inside the thin wing, tended to jam
under high G loads.
Engine temperatures ran hot during ground operations. The canopy design created blind areas that German fighters could exploit. Ground crews and pilots worked side by side to address these shortcomings, developing field modifications that were eventually sent back to the manufacturer. The later P-51D, with its bubble canopy and improved gun installation, was partly the result of combat experience fed back through these channels. The P-51 Mustang continued flying long after the war ended. It served in Korea, where it flew ground attack missions during the opening months of the conflict. It served with air forces around the world, remaining in operational service in some countries into the 1980s. More than 15,000 Mustangs were produced during the war, with some sources estimating as many as 15,500, including variants built under license. The P-51D model alone accounted for more than 8,000 aircraft, more than half of total production. Thousands still survive today, many of them airworthy and flying at air shows and commemorative events. The distinctive growl of the Merlin engine has become one of the most recognizable sounds in aviation.
But the Mustang's true legacy is not the aircraft that endure.
It is the victory it made possible. Before the Mustang, the Allied strategic bombing campaign was failing. American bombers could not survive deep penetration missions without fighter escort, and no fighter had the range to accompany them.
The doctrine of self-defending bomber formations had been proven wrong at terrible cost.
The Mustang changed everything. It provided the bombers with the protection they required. More importantly, it gave the Americans a weapon capable of destroying the Luftwaffe fighter force not only in the air, but on the ground and in the training schools where new pilots were supposed to be produced. The air superiority won by the Mustang and its pilots made D-Day possible. It made the advance across France possible. It made the crossing of the Rhine possible. Every major Allied ground operation from June 1944 onward depended on control of the sky, and control of the sky belonged to the P-51. When Hermann Göring saw those American fighters over Berlin, he understood what was coming. The invasion, the collapse, the defeat, the destruction of everything the Nazi regime had built, it was all there in that moment, visible to anyone who knew how to read the signs.
The Mustangs over Berlin meant that Germany would lose the war.
Ronald Harker, the Rolls-Royce test pilot who first suggested installing a Merlin engine in the Mustang, never became famous. His contribution to the war effort was technical, largely invisible to the public, but incalculably important.
He lived until 1999, dying at the age of 90.
His obituaries in the Times and the Daily Telegraph mentioned his work on the Merlin-powered Mustang, but most people had never heard his name.
That is often how the most important innovations occur.
Not through dramatic breakthroughs announced to cheering crowds, but through quiet conversations between engineers and pilots.
Someone notices a problem. Someone proposes a solution. Someone has the authority to make it happen. Harker noticed that the Mustang was fast but underpowered at altitude. He suggested the Merlin. Rolls-Royce management gave him permission to try it.
And from that simple sequence, one of the most important aircraft of the 20th century was born.
The bomber crews who survived because Mustangs escorted them home likely never knew Harker's name.
The ground soldiers who landed at Normandy under friendly skies certainly did not. But all of them owed their lives, in part, to a test pilot who flew a disappointing American fighter for 30 minutes in April 1942 and came down with an idea. That is how wars are won, not only by the soldiers and pilots who do the fighting, but by the engineers, designers, and technicians who give them the tools they need.
The Mustang was the right airplane in the right place at the right time.
But it only became that airplane because someone recognized its potential and found a way to unlock it. Wars are won by people who see possibilities where others see only problems. Ronald Harker saw a great airplane trapped inside a mediocre one, and he had the vision and persistence to set it free. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories.
Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered, and we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from.
Our community stretches from Texas to Tasmania, from veterans to history enthusiasts. You are part of something special here.
Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.